Then I get calls from guys, United Nations calls. Another enlightening moment. United Nations. I always taught in the end times, the United Nations is where the Antichrist shows up, takes it over. It's a one world government against the persecuted Christians. That's what Hal Lindsey said. I figured it was true. So, then I find out, well, that's not exactly true. They have a whole thing, NGOs, which is non-government, which is basically a whole big part of it, which is the kind of like the global missionary team. They drill wells for water. They provide emergency relief. They bring the food in, and they have goals for the millennium. Anyway, so I had to speak for this NGO gathering in Canada. They didn't like the United States. It's true. And more interesting yet, it was a woman who was in charge of the group. More interesting yet, she was a Muslim. You talk about an incongruent phenomena. I've left Babylon to get away from the world, and now the Lord's saying, go to this United Nations meeting and connect with the Muslim woman and go speak to all of the NGOs of the United Nations. And some friends of mine who were in the United Nations had set it up because they had faith that I was supposed to do it. And so I was sweating bullets because I only knew how to preach and teach one thing. I had been steeped for like 20 years in this one philosophy. This is the Bible. It's the Word of God. It's teaching. It's praying. It's revival. It's this thing. It never occurred to me that something was shifting, that God was sending us into all the world, and that actually all the world belongs to Him, not just the church and revival and evangelism culture. So I didn't know what I was going to preach. And I was desperately afraid I was going to trigger some kind of international incident by accident. Because I had no idea how it worked. I just didn't want to say something provocative. So the Lord starts dealing with me on the subject of emotional intelligence. And what I discovered is there's a whole field of human resource knowledge and material, psychology, behavior, systems, organizations, which is actually fair territory. Do you believe that God is the God of the whole earth? Do you think it's possible Edison stumbled upon some God principles, and whether or not he ever wrote a Pentecostal testimony, he stumbled upon something God designed and he did not work around the system, but he discovered it? So what you have to have is a mentality that says you have to learn from sources other than the church and discern what's from God. Because unfortunately, a little bit of the old influence of the Catholic Church creeps into Pentecostal theology as well, which is we're the authority, we're anointed, be careful, don't get deceived. We have such a sniffer for deception, we become stupid. Because we're listening to only one or two or three viewpoints, and like most people in the media today, we go back to reinforce our own prejudices by our favorite voices. So if you're MSNBC, you're always MSNBC. If you're Fox, you're always Fox. The problem with that, it's not effective, intelligent discussion when you're only hearing one side of a conversation. So I began to realize that God gave downloads to Steve Jobs. He gave it to Bill Gates. He gave it to, matter of fact, I heard Lou Engle say this once, and I thought, that makes sense. He said, what if Bill Gates, prophetically, is the gates of innovation and wealth that God couldn't get over to a believer because believers were so hung up on a definition of what their calling was that they wouldn't pursue what God gave them because they didn't feel it was spiritual enough. Now, how many of you know, with the spiritual secular split, the way that we approach this great divide, we actually put filters on that judges sources as whether it's God or not because they're not using our favorite buzzwords and they're not coming from our filters. Does that make sense to you?